Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael, on a Monday, joined by Mike Aquilina, returning guest. And we're talking about his new book, Africa in the Early Church, The Almost Forgotten Roots of Catholic Christianity, published by Emmaus. I have a link to it right there in the show notes in the description if you want to go and purchase a copy. Mike, great to have you back on the show. How you been?
I've been fine. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, yeah. Always excited to have you. Every time you write a book, it's always profound. You know what? The last interview that we had, we were talking about the church fathers on friendship and your
Mm.
book on that. And I found that so helpful. A lot of people will come to me and ask questions on advice for evangelism. And I always point out the fact, you know what? Mike Aquilina noted the early church, the way they converted people was through friendships. So work on those. So I always appreciate your content, and I was really excited to see that you wrote a book on this. First of all, tell me a little bit why you decided to write on this particular topic.
Well, I have to give the credit where it's due. Originally I wrote on the topic of Africa in the early church because my editor at Angelus asked me to do so. A couple of years back, maybe 3 years back now, he asked me if I would write an article about Africa and its role in early Christianity, its place in early Christianity, and I said sure I would, and I wrote something up focusing mostly on the Roman province of Africa or North Africa. And I was genuinely surprised by the response. And not only that, Pablo was surprised by the response. At the end of the year, he told me that article had received more engagement than any other article that they'd posted for the year. So that told me that I was telling people something that they had not known. That they were receiving this as news. They found it interesting, and that maybe I should write a book about it, and I did.
It's a curious thing because Africa, it's in early church history is just filled with great Christian theologians. And yet, whenever we think of Christianity, a lot of people don't tend to think of Africa. So I'm glad that you decided to touch on this. It's certainly needed. Let's maybe talk about the roots of North Africa and Christianity there. Can you maybe give us a little bit of background?
Well, the roots are kind of shrouded in mist. We don't have great documentary roots of the church in North Africa. It seems to emerge fully formed around the year 170 A.D., and that's always an illusion, right? What happens is that you reach a critical mass. People start to notice you. People outside the church start to notice the church, and sometimes it becomes a problem. They worry that you're seditious. They worry that the urban legends they had heard about Christians might be true, and should we do something to enforce the laws that exist to suppress Christianity? So that's often how Christianity first shows up on the historical record in many places, and that's certainly how it does in North Africa. Many historians believe, examining the earliest evidence, that it probably started in the synagogues in Carthage, which was a port city, and had a Jewish population because it was a port city. There's always kind of a concentration of Jews and a synagogue in the major city. In that Carthage was the major city in North Africa. So it seems that it emerged in the synagogue, as was the case in most places on earth. You follow the Acts of the Apostles, and that's kind of what shows up. And even beyond the Acts of the Apostles, that seems to be the history of the early growth of the church in places like Alexandria and Antioch and Rome, that it grew out of the local synagogues. But it seems to emerge fully formed. The first documentary evidence we have is a court transcript of an interrogation of several Christians who are denounced, who are caught in the act, and who are going to be sent to their death. And so that shows up around 170 A.D. And shortly after that, we have kind of an explosive presence arriving on the scene in the person of Tertullian, who is the first great theologian writing in Latin. And he is just beyond great. He's just got this style that's memorable, and he's he's great at kind of coining phrases that
Mm,
in common parlance. He's the one who introduces the word Trinitas, uh,
mhm,
to denote the Christian Godhead, the Trinity. He's the one who introduces the word sacramentum to represent the Greek word mysterion, the
mm.
mysteries, the liturgical mysteries of the church become the sacraments in the West. Thanks to Tertullian, he's the one who introduces these words into the bloodstream of the Western Church. So he's a giant, and he is the great voice of the first generation, or we should say, the first known generation of the church in North Africa.
And he's writing in Carthage, is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, which is the major city. It's a
Mhm.
port city, and Carthage has an interesting history. Carthage was at war with Rome for many years, more than a century, and Rome finally, when it put down Carthage, it put down Carthage, but good,
Mhm.
and colonized it with Romans. So this is all in the years before Christ, and by the time Christianity is first showing up on the scene, Carthage has become a major metropolis again, and it's also become a major cultural center for Latin culture.
Mm,
And what's interesting is that the Latin Christian culture that emerges from Carthage becomes profoundly influential on the Christian culture as it's developing in Italy.
mm,
Now, we think of Latin as the Italian language, as the Roman language, but here we have the Latin culture that's forming in Carthage, exercising a deep influence on Rome, where the liturgy was in Greek
mm,
probably until the middle of the 4th century. We find a Latin liturgy emerging in Carthage perhaps as early as the 2nd century, and then influencing liturgical trends on the other side of the sea in Italy in the centuries that followed. And that seems to be the way liturgical trends took place. They emerged out of North Africa, and then they affected the Italian peninsula. And we shouldn't be surprised by this, because it's the way literature was developing at the time. Carthage was undergoing, experiencing a literary renaissance at that time.
mm,
The great novelist Apuleius was writing in North Africa. The playwright Terence was writing in North Africa. Many of the great legal minds of that time were emerging out of North Africa, and we all often find evidence of North African jurists practicing in the capital city of Rome. So Carthage is really enjoying its moment of sunshine, really, as a literary culture, a Latin culture, and for its place in the Roman Empire.
and I wanna talk about some of the specific, contributions of various individuals in Africa. You mentioned Tertullian there, and you did touch on a few of his contributions when it comes to the terminology that we use, the Trinity sacraments. What were some additional contributions that Tertullian offered?
Well, he contributed a lot of arguments.
Mm,
He was very good he was most likely a lawyer, a legal scholar, and
yeah.
he was good at constructing arguments, apologetic arguments, and so he really was part of that first wave that responded to not only the urban legends but also the arguments that pagans had against Christianity, that it was anti-traditional.
Mm,
It was seditious. It was all of these other things, and Tertullian uh, points out, for example, that Christians already made up a great number of the people who were getting the work done in North Africa. He shows how we occupy the market and the military base and
mm,
and the halls of government and all of these other places, and we've left paganism nothing but its temples. So Christians were already enjoying a certain dominance at that time, because the best and brightest, like Tertullian, who was an adult convert, were being drawn toward Christianity because it was reasonable,
mm.
but also because they believed it was true.
Some say that he fell away from the church in his later days, and others point to scholarship that questions that. Where do you weigh in on that one? Just curious.
I think we can't know for sure, right?
Hmm.
So what we do know about Tertullian is that at a certain point in his adult life, he becomes sympathetic to the Montanists.
Mm,
The Montanists were a kind of charismatic sect that emphasized prophecy,
mhm,
living prophecy, that prophecy was still operative in the church, and that it was authoritative in the
mhm,
church,
mhm,
right? So there was that dimension to it. They also tended to be very disciplined and moral rigorists, and
mhm,
this was at a time when people like Tertullian were questioning the strength of the bishops, right? Because the bishops seemed to be a little too merciful. They would call
mm,
them laxist, actually. And Tertullian really stood for a more rigorous enforcement of the moral discipline of the church. So he worried
mhm,
that the bishops and even the Pope were becoming a little too lax at that time. So he threw his sympathies with the Montanists. He wrote several of his works as a Montanist, essentially. But we don't know what that meant at the time,
mhm.
because the Montanists did get progressively weirder and
Yeah,
eventually found themselves outside the confines of the Catholic Church. But we don't know if they were there yet.
yeah, yeah.
They may not have been gone that far. What we do, and then Tertullian just kind of vanishes from the historical record. We just don't know what happened to him. We don't know how he died, where he died, when he died.
Mm,
What we do know is that a few years later, after his death, no less a man than Cyprian of Carthage, in one of the great figures of the third century church, is referring to Tertullian as the master. He would
yes,
say to his assistant, "Bring me the master."
yes.
And it seems unlikely to me that Cyprian would have said that about someone who died
Mm,
outside the church.
yeah,
So I don't know what
yeah.
the story is there. I'm sure it's fascinating. I don't think we'll ever know.
I was thinking the same thing because of that point from Cyprian, "Bring me
Yeah.
my master." It's like, why would you mention that if this guy fell away from the church? So, yeah, it's a really good point. Now, you bring up Cyprian there, so that's another individual,
Yeah.
in Africa. Let's maybe talk about him unless you have,
Oh, no.
some other figures that you wanted to address in between.
No, and one thing I'll say for Cyprian is that
Mhm,
he gave us so many of the great lines that reside in our consciousness as Catholics, just as Tertullian had before him. Tertullian said memorable things like, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? See
mhm,
how those Christians love one another." All of these lines that are just part of our inner life. They just arise in our consciousness if we're Catholics with any sense of tradition at all. And Cyprian is another one of those guys. And one of the lines we remember him for is, "Outside the church there is no salvation."
mhm,
So to me, that strengthens this sense that Tertullian died within the confines of the church, because we have Cyprian saying, "Outside the church there's no salvation," referring to Tertullian as the master. So Cyprian is a man who converts late in life. Again, he was a great rhetorician and lawyer in Carthage. He very soon after his conversion, he's made bishop of Carthage, and it's one of the most difficult times to be bishop in any city. At that time, there was a plague that was just raging through the empire.
mm,
It's sometimes now called the plague of Cyprian, because
mm,
Cyprian provides us one of our greatest records of the plague through his correspondence and through his treatises. So Cyprian is living at this time where there's plague, and he's also living at a time of the most intense persecution of the church, or at least the first widespread and intense persecution of the church, the persecution of Decius, which began right in the middle of the third century. So Cyprian is left to manage the church in the midst of these two crises, which become one crisis because the pagans start to blame the Christians for the plague.
mm,
They say the gods are angry because the Christians are not offering sacrifice. They're not getting the smoke they used to get from the temples on earth. And so they're blaming the Christians, and the persecution becomes all the more intense at that time. Cyprian had to work out in real time, how do you live at a time of this sort of persecution? Because what they wanted was for you just to go up there and give some show of
Mm-hmm.
of fealty to the gods, right? Just a little pinch of incense on the altar would be enough. That's all you have to do. And once you did that, you didn't have to do it again. You
Mm-hmm.
got a little ticket that you could carry with you in your pocket and present it to the authorities whenever they asked, and show that you had offered sacrifice once and done, and you were in the clear. So suddenly there were these new moral questions that came up. Could you get a counterfeit ticket,
Yeah.
that you just carried around? Or by doing that, are you causing scandal and causing other people to sin, because they assume that a good man like Joseph out there is offering sacrifice. So these are new moral questions. And then what do you do with the people who have offered sacrifice and then regretted it later on and want to be reunited with the church? How severe should be your discipline to them? Cyprian is trying to work with all of these things in real time, and he becomes an international figure, communicating with the Pope, who's also trying to wrestle these things to answers. And so Cyprian becomes a major figure of the 3rd century, an international figure, and yet he was a Christian just for a few years of his life, because he was late in arriving at the church. He was bishop, and then he was martyred. So he wasn't a Christian for all that long, but he had a short, happy life.
Am I misremembering? But I think initially he underwent some persecution and left his episcopate or left his see. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
So there, and in explaining himself, he provides one of the first discussions of the prudence you need to exercise in times of persecution. You have to weigh, am I more valuable to the church as bishop right now, as a living bishop who's exercising his office in hiding? And he had to ask himself those hard questions and be pretty scrupulous about the answers, because he knew that eventually he would probably die as a martyr, since he was the most public member of the church. But he had to exercise prudence about when that would happen. When he would make himself available to his captors. So yes, he has a fascinating biography for his time, and also, like Tertullian, as I said, he gave us so much of so many of the principles, so much of the language that we use for expressing the faith. The phrase "prefer nothing to Christ," which about the primacy of Jesus Christ, is often attributed to Saint Benedict. But he used that phrase, quoting his Latin master, Saint Cyprian, from centuries before. He's also the one who said, "No one can have God for his father who has not the church for his mother." Cyprian is really a giant on the world scene and in the history of the church.
I want to get to Augustine eventually here, but I want to shift from Carthage to another location first, Alexandria. Who are some key figures there in Alexandria? Really, what's the importance of Alexandria in Christianity, in the early church?
Well, Alexandria is the intellectual capital of the Roman Empire. Yeah. It's where so much was happening. Very vibrant place. And there was a large Jewish population there too. Modern historians estimate that about 10% of the population of Alexandria in Egypt were Jews. So the Jews had a presence in Alexandria. They were often part of the leadership there, and they had important positions within the government. Because the synagogue was very active there and had prominent figures like Philo, there were cultural institutions in place, cultural monuments in place that Christianity could just build off. Philo is is writing in the first century. Philo is writing commentaries on the Old Testament books that are allegorical, and
Yeah.
they lend themselves to the typology that was practiced by the Christians later on. Many of the church fathers freely adopted Philo's methods and even used Philo's text itself, incorporating it into their own texts. So Philo was someone valuable to the early Christians. The synagogues, as I said, were very active. St. Mark, by tradition, is supposed to have established the church in Alexandria. We know that it's quite likely that Apollos, the great figure, the super apostle, who's mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's Corinthian correspondence, is also a figure of the early church in Alexandria. So there's a lot going on, a lot of intellectual vitality, and we see the church emerging from that scene about the same time that it emerges in North Africa. This seems to be when Christians are gaining critical mass in these lands, and so the first figures to appear on the scene are figures like Pantaenus, who's from Sicily, but of course, as an intellectual, goes to the intellectual capital, perhaps converts to Christianity there, but in any case becomes a figure, perhaps the founding figure of the school of Alexandria, the catechetical school in Alexandria. And among his great successors at that school are luminaries from the early church like Clement of Alexandria or Origen of Alexandria. And then later on, of course, other figures follow like Athanasius and Cyril and so many more.
Oh yeah. Very key figures. Now you mentioned Origen there. What role did he really play in early Christianity in Africa?
Well, his father was a great teacher in the catechetical school, and Origen kind of grew up as his father's student, his father's pupil. He was a young man, in his teens when his father was taken off and martyred. Origen wanted to die as a martyr at the same time, but his mother hid his clothing, so he couldn't go out in public without causing a scandal. So Origen, listens to his mother. He calms down. He realizes he has to support the family now that his father is gone, and he takes over the running of the catechetical school. He becomes one of the great teachers of Christian antiquity and one of the foremost biblical scholars of all time. He does a critical edition of the Bible with multiple versions in parallel columns, so you could compare different translations. You could also read the original Hebrew and see it transliterated, so you could get the sound of it as well. He was just a great mind. He wrote thousands of books, commentaries and homilies and apologetic works and works of secular culture. He got quite a reputation for this. He even became the tutor to the emperor's mother. So he was an important figure, not only in the church, but in the world. He was often called upon as a consultant by bishops in far-flung places. And he was likely the first speculative theologian in the church, at least the first speculative theologian who really strove to stay within the bounds of orthodoxy. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether or not he did. He succeeded in that, but he tried, and he always told his listeners or his readers or his students to stay with the Catholic Church. If he seemed to be at odds with the Catholic Church in any way, stay with the Catholic Church.
Yeah. So it seems like his heart, his intention was there to be within the church and to be orthodox in nature. Where do you weigh in on this? Do you think that he eventually went into error in some points? I mean, because obviously later on he was condemned by several of the ecumenical councils, but some people are saying, okay, well, no, maybe they misjudged him. Where do you weigh in on all this?
Well, I think that there's no doubt that he strayed into error on some points.
Yeah.
The preexistence of souls, human souls, and a few other points. And of course, as you point out, his doctrine was condemned, and even he was condemned by some ecumenical councils. There's a lot of debate about whether you can excommunicate a dead man. Well, we have that debate because of Origen. So I think I can trust his contemporaries to that extent, that he did fall into error, and even he provided bad example, I think, by some of the choices he made in life. Uh,
Mm.
Self-castration is always a bad policy.
Mhm. Mhm.
But he I think his intention was always to be with the church. And he proved it at the end of his life. He was a confessor. He likely would have been a martyr. It's said that he was tortured to the point of death, but not beyond that point,
Mm.
because his torturers knew that that would be the greatest torture for him, that he would not follow in the footsteps of his father, who had
Mm.
been martyred, and he was left to live in great pain for the remaining years of his life. So I guess I'm an optimist. I don't know, but I'm optimistic about Origen, the way I am about Tertullian.
Sure, sure. Now you mentioned another figure there, a giant in the faith, Athanasius of Alexandria. He really put Africa on the map. So
Well, yeah, yeah, and you think about what he was dealing with. There was the first major heresy to infect the church, and that's the heresy of Arianism. And it came into Africa from outside,
Mhm.
by a priest who had trained in Antioch. But he brought it into Alexandria, and Alexandria became ground zero. So we're on the African continent now for one of the most formative episodes in church history, the appearance of this heresy of
Mm.
Arius, the condemnation of Arius by his bishop Alexander, and then later by Alexander's successor Athanasius, and all of these episodes really in the Egyptian and Libyan church led to the Council of Nicaea, which didn't take place in Africa, but very much concerned events on the African continent.
Yeah, and he came out. I think he was a deacon at the council, right? But then
Right.
later on became a bishop and was just really, really helpful in bringing the theology that Nicaea decided.
That's right. He seems to have been a deeper theological thinker than his great patron and his predecessor Alexander. So it,
Mhm.
it seems quite likely that Alexander recognized this and brought him to Nicaea as his secretary to help him articulate his case against Arius, which of course prevailed at the council.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the massive figure that we have to address is going to be, of course, Augustine. I mean, I think
Mm.
out of all of the theologians in church history, he's maybe what top three, I would imagine, and of course, out of Africa, I think he would be the most prominent. At least that's my opinion. So,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
The guy's just a giant, and he's
yeah.
such a warm figure. Uh, you know, he he is the author most quoted
Mm,
outside the authors of sacred scripture,
mm,
by St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa. He is the author most quoted in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So
mm.
obviously he looms large as an authority, and even the authority to the authorities in Western Catholicism. So here's this great figure, and if you're Protestant, right? If you
Mhm,
if you
mhm.
say that if you identify with the Calvinist or the Lutheran strains of Protestantism, then you look to Augustine
Yeah.
as their great forefather because he's the one they cited most often. So Augustine is just a giant in the West, and he was a giant in his own time. He invented new literary genres. He
Mm,
held the chair in rhetoric at the imperial court. He produced so many volumes of correspondence and preaching and theology that no matter what branch of theology you want to study, you likely have to begin with a work of Augustine's. If you're going to study the Trinity, you have to read De Trinitate pretty early. In
mm,
your formation. If you're going to study morals, if you're going to study ethics, you have to begin with the morals of the Catholic Church.
mhm.
Augustine is just a giant. If he had been the only Christian ever produced by the African continent, we would still owe everything to Africa.
That's
But
a
he's
good
not.
point.
There were millions
Sure.
of Christians produced by Africa in this period.
Yeah, now there were 2 major controversies that were, issues that Augustine had to address during his lifetime: the Pelagian controversy and the Donatists. Tell us a little bit about his role in those.
Oh well, boy, well, he was involved in so many
Yeah,
controversies,
yeah,
but those two are probably the major ones. You're
yeah,
right,
yeah.
and he did figure in the the resolution of these problems.
Hmm.
The Donatist the controversy goes back to the persecutions we were talking about before, when some of the bishops and other clergy had really done treacherous things. They had either turned over the sacred scriptures to the pagans during the persecution, or they had turned other people. Later, they regretted this. They did penance for this, and they were welcomed back to the practice of the faith. Now, a lot of people, especially those who had suffered for the faith, did not want to have communion with these people, and especially they did not want to look to them as clergy, as leaders. They did not want them to be the people saying mass and baptizing the next generation. So they went into schism in North Africa, and the Donatist Church was rather large. This was no small splinter group. It wasn't like the tiny SSPX parish that we have in Pittsburgh, right? No, this was a large network of parishes, just kind of a parallel structure to the Catholic Church in North Africa. And Augustine went about this in many ways. One, he tried to reason with them, and he tried to debate with them. He did, and he tried to reconcile them in all the usual peaceful ways. He was also willing to work with the government to suppress them, because it was in the government's best interest to have unity in religion in North Africa. He knew that, and he was willing to take advantage of that. He saw a different kind of threat later on with Pelagianism, and that he saw as kind of a spiritual cancer that could take hold in the body of Christ here on earth in the church, and it could lead people the wrong way, leading them to pay too little mind to the sacraments, and to esteem their own powers a bit too much, and to rely on themselves for salvation. Pelagianism was extremely optimism in this way, and said that we could get to perfection through our own efforts. It's just a lot easier if you have Christianity and the sacraments working for you. So again, he had to work internationally and to coordinate the work of many different scholars in many different places as he attacked Pelagianism, and he had to be savvy. He was very good at this. He did this with the Manichaeans as well. He himself had been a Manichaean, and he did this with other groups, including the Arians, and he had a lot of success in countering these many heresies, these many schisms. Although in his dying days, he knew that the Arian Vandals were besieging his city and were likely to win. They were likely to be victorious and take over the city. So it's kind of a twilight moment in his last days, where he knew that the old Roman order is falling, and with it certain protections of the Christian church.
Earlier you mentioned Cyprian was combating those who were blaming the church. I think it was Cyprian that you said, combating those who are blaming the church for what's going on in society, perhaps because people are no longer offering sacrifices to the gods, or at least Christians aren't. And so that's why calamities are happening.
Yeah.
Well, that was another issue that Augustine addressed in the City of God. Talk a little bit about that.
I have a feeling that those charges never went away. The people who were hurling them at the church became fewer and fewer in number as the centuries wore on. And paganism just declined in influence. The old religion declined in influence. But really, Augustine is still hearing them in the 5th century, and that really is the point of his City of God, because at the time there's a crisis going on. Rome had been breached, right?
Mm,
Rome had been sacked. And this was always thought to be impossible, that Rome somehow enjoyed some kind of divine protection even before Christianity and then into the Christian years. And now, as Christianity was spreading and Christianity was the official and then pretty much the only subsidized religion in the empire, um, the empire itself seems to be falling just at the moment when it's giving everything it has to Christianity. So how do you explain that, Mr. Augustine? and and really, that was the genesis. That challenge was the genesis of his great City of God. His last great work, where he's defending the church against these charges, and really he's establishing a profound theology of history that we're still kind of working out into our own day.
yeah, yeah, very helpful. Now let's shift gears and let's talk about monasticism in Africa and the role it played in producing the concept of Christian monasticism, and maybe also some of the figures who are prominent there. Let's talk about that.
Well, the first great figures are in Egypt, right? So they
Mm,
are on the African continent there, and they're figures like Anthony, uh, who is often called the father of monasticism in the church, even though he arrives rather late on the scene, right? So
mm,
he's doing this in the he's entering monastic life in the middle of the third century. Uh, he came from a Christian family, though, and he knew of other ascetics who were living in the desert and living as solitaries before him, right? He himself was a disciple of Paul the Hermit. So uh, Anthony really, though, becomes the first celebrity monk, right, in the church's history, and he becomes a magnet. People
mm,
want to go out and get counsel, spiritual direction from Anthony, and they would go out to the desert to just pick his brain, so to speak, and get guidance in their lives from him. And many of them stayed.
mm,
So it became like a city in the desert. And so there followed a period of monastic culture in the Egyptian desert. 100 years where many forms of monasticism emerged, and Anthony is at the root of it all, but it's going in many different directions from Anthony. Uh, um, but it's not only there. Monasticism, asceticism, really existed in the church in every age. We have even at the time of the apostolic fathers, we have abundant evidence that there were ascetics who lived in the cities in those times, who lived celibate lives. And sometimes they lived in community, sometimes they lived as solitaries. So this is something that was always there in the church. What we find in the fourth century with the legalization of Christianity is the first attempt, actually many attempts, to discipline this process, to give it some kind of form, to give it some kind of rules.
mm.
And one of the great rules that we get from the 5th century is the rule of St. Augustine, because he himself lived in community with other clerics, and they lived according to a rule of life. He also was spiritual director for a number of ascetical women who lived in community, and he gave them a rule as well. So we have a lot of the just the foundational work for monasticism going on the African continent. We also have a lot of the intellectual work of monasticism going on in the African continent.
I think also Anthony and a few others in Africa impacted the rule of Saint Benedict, which would then say that Africa then influenced Western monasticism.
Absolutely, no doubt about that. Benedict himself is just borrowing from a lot of different sources. He was a magpie, really.
Mhm.
He liked to take the bright, shiny things from a lot of different things, a lot of different traditions, and bring them together for his own monks, his own rule. So yeah, absolutely, they've had a profound influence, and not only through Benedict, but through Benedict's sources as well. Let's remember that John Cassian, who was profoundly influential on Benedict, brought a lot of the stories of the Desert Fathers back from Egypt, where he had spent a good bit of his youth.
You know, I've heard that monasticism arose in Africa kind of as a form of martyrdom because there was no longer persecution from the government. So people looked for another form of martyrdom. Is there any truth to that?
Well, there may be. That's sociology, I guess. We're
Mhm,
trying to figure out what motivates these people.
mhm,
But again, I think that we see, going back to the first generation of the church, and even going back to the Gospels, we find that that figure of John the Baptist, who went off
mm,
to live by himself and eat a wretched diet and dress in wretched clothing and endure all kinds of discomforts because he wanted to be alone with God, and he needed to be alone with God, and he was called to be alone with God. And if he was called in that generation to live that way, and we see that our Lord Jesus himself lived that way in his own generation, in
mhm,
his 40 days in the desert, in his times alone on the mountaintop, on through his practice of
mhm,
celibacy. And then we find St. Paul again observing celibacy in the next generation, even though St. Paul was hardly a recluse. He did live part of his life as a recluse, his early years as a Christian. So we find these elements of monastic life in the gospel generation, and then in the writings of the apostolic fathers. Both Clement and Ignatius talk about the role of celibates in the church, the role of consecrated virgins, and both Clement and Ignatius urge them not to be proud because of their status. So already they've gained this
mm.
status just by living this way within the church. And we find similar warnings about the life of consecrated men and women in the centuries that followed. So I have to believe it was there in every generation, even during times of persecution. Anthony himself, went into monastic life at a time of significant persecution, and he remained in monastic life through a time, and he drew through a time of persecution, and he drew a lot of those disciples into the desert during a time of persecution. So I have to believe that it's always been there. It's more visible
Mm.
at a time during when the church is at peace, and and then maybe you have the Irish monks who are who are doing more and more outlandish things because there's not enough of a sense of danger at home. Getting on a boat and just drifting off to sea and that sort of thing. So you have that going on, but I don't know is
Yeah,
is
yeah.
is the bottom line. Yeah.
I want to talk about the third part of your book,
Mhm.
and I'm so happy you addressed it. Ethiopian Christianity. Can you first tell us, how did Christianity come to Ethiopia?
You check the Acts of the Apostles, right? And there on the first Christian Pentecost, we learn that there are people from many African places. There are
Mm,
Libyans, right, for
mm,
example, and Egyptians who are in Jerusalem for the feast day. There were Jews in these places, and they returned to Jerusalem for the mandatory feasts. Uh, we know that there was an Israelite presence in Ethiopia from early on. The traditions are there. We have the evidence from the Old Testament of the Queen of Sheba, going to King Solomon to gain wisdom from him, and then the traditions that she became one of his wives, right? And she became pregnant by him and went back to Ethiopia where her son would rule after her. Uh, and of course, there were all kinds of traditions after that son went back to Jerusalem and absconded with the Ark of the Covenant and brought it to Ethiopia. Those traditions are still held dear by Christians in Ethiopia today. Um, so there was a presence there in Ethiopia, and in the Acts of the Apostles, we know the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, right? Who is evangelized by Philip and baptized by him, and his conversion is there on the record, and we have to believe that he must have been motivated to bring the gospel back and spread it in Ethiopia. So I think it's likely that there were Christians in Ethiopia from that first generation, from the gospel generation. Again, they don't show up in the historical record, the documentary record, until later on, but I believe that they were there from the beginning. What we find in Ethiopia is is a is a Christianity where the traditions of Israelite religion were carefully preserved, so that some of the uh, the the extra canonical books
Mm.
to us in Western Christianity are canonical in 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 Ethiopia, like the Book of Enoch, right? First Enoch is canonical in Ethiopia, and also there are the elements in church decoration that there's a replica of the Ark of the Covenant in the churches in Ethiopia. So we find distinctively Israelite character to the faith as it develops in Ethiopia.
Yeah, you're talking here about the Ark of the Covenant, and that's one of the things that you address in the book. Talk to us about the importance of the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopian Christianity.
Well, as I said in the book, there is the tradition that the son of Solomon went back and then absconded with it, so it's been preserved there since. That is still believed, that there is a monk who guards the Ark of the Covenant. He's the only one allowed to lay eyes on it. That one monk who lives his entire life in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. So that is very much there. It's a sense of the Israelite origins of Ethiopian Christianity and the pre-Christian Israelite presence in that country. And again, if the court official of the Queen of Ethiopia is going to Jerusalem for the feasts, then there's something to that. Uh,
Hmm.
and there's other evidence of it as well outside the canonical scriptures that this was going on. So again, this is a place where the traditions of the Second Temple and maybe even the First Temple are being preserved, and it's going on through the time of the fathers and down to our own time.
Is there strong evidence beyond the historical realm? Is there strong otherwise kinds of evidence to substantiate the claim in your research?
For the Ark of the Covenant,
Yeah, yeah,
I don't see it. I
yeah.
don't see it because we don't find those mentions of it during the first millennium,
Mhm,
during a time when there was a bit of obsession with
mhm.
relics and where they were, and where you could visit them, and pilgrimage, and where you could go to see this or that or the other thing, and that's just not going on. And also, there was the great controversy over the rebuilding of the temple
Mhm.
under Julian the Apostate in the middle of the fourth century. I imagine that at one of those points it would have come up and it would have entered the historical record, and we
Mm.
just don't see it anywhere.
Are there any other unique features to Ethiopian Christianity?
Oh, there are a lot of things that are just beautiful. The tradition of icons is much different from what we're used to in the Christian East or in the Christian West. They're haunting. They're beautiful icons. Um, there are the churches in Ethiopia itself that are carved out of a single rock,
Mm,
uh, and they've just dated some of these churches to the fourth century. So these are Paleo-Christian churches still standing today, carved out of a single rock. Uh, it's a place where there should be a lot more pilgrimage from Westerners who are interested in this time period. I've never been there myself. I'd love to see it sometime.
well, tell me about the importance of Africa for Christianity today. What role do you think that it is playing and can play in the future?
I think we've got to recognize that so much of our heritage has come from Africa. That
Mhm,
liturgical tradition, if you're a Western Christian, the
mhm,
ways you worship likely derived from African forms, North African forms, the forms that were practiced in Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, right?
mhm.
That's where we get our ways of worship. And we have to recognize that, celebrate it. These are our African roots. Also, get to know the great African saints, Perpetua and Felicity, Tertullian, Sir Cyprian, Lactantius, Arnobius, and the great Augustine, and claim them as our own. Know that this is part of our church, and the church owes so much to the continent of Africa. It's a beautiful thing to see. It's a beautiful thing to reclaim. Uh, I think that we don't know this because there's been discontinuity
Yeah.
in the church in North Africa. With the Arab invasions of the 600s, the 700s, those countries fell one by one to Islam. And so there has not been a presence of African Christians, or there was not a presence of African Christians in the international concerns of the church in the years following the 700s. But we've got to reclaim what's ours from those lands and encourage, as we can, the Christians who remain in those lands, because often they're living heroic lives. They continue to be oppressed, persecuted, if not martyred. We remember the Coptic martyrs of just a few years back, who died by the hands of their persecutors, and it was broadcast on video to the world. And now we see their icons emerging everywhere. So we see in that a connection to our ancient past, and I think that that we begin to recover, reclaim, and be who we're supposed to be as Christians with roots in that period.
Yeah, very, very helpful. Anything else that you wanted to address that we didn't get a chance to talk about from the book? Anything else you want to sneak in there?
No, unless you want to go for a few more hours. But no. I think you hit on all the major points of the book, and certainly what excites me about the book and about getting the word out there to people. As I said, when I first wrote that article, it got more response than anything that Angelus magazine had published that year. I was very pleased with that, and I'm very pleased that I can get this word out to even more people through the book.
Absolutely. Everybody go and purchase a copy. There is a link in the show notes to it, Africa in the Early Church by Mike Aquilina. Go ahead and put in a plug for anything else that you're working on you want to make the audience aware of.
Oh, just get to know the work of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. It's the St. Paul Center's publishing house, Emmaus Road Press, that brought out my book, Africa in the Early Church. And I've been involved with the St. Paul Center since its founding, and I'm proud of that. I'm pleased with that, and I'm very excited about where the center is going. We just launched an academy for online classes. It's pretty exciting. We've got great people like Scott Hahn, John Bergsma, and others giving classes for us online that you can take advantage of. We've got great events coming up. We've got a building that we're building, brick and mortar in Steubenville, across the street from Franciscan University. So a lot of movement going on there, a lot of excitement.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And do you have any books that you're working on that you could tell us about?
Well, this year I'm working on I have just finished up little biographies of St. John Chrysostom and St. Athanasius. I'm also in the middle of a little biography of St. Patrick, and I have a couple other things I'm poking around with. I'm just beginning, so I'll keep them under wraps for now till they're more developed.
Sure. Well, looking forward to seeing more from you. Thank you so much for coming on. Always an honor to have you.
Oh, man, it's an honor to be here. Thanks again. I always enjoy the conversation.
Thank you. And everybody hit the like button and the subscribe button. Of course, check me out. Also, if you want to support me, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll get extra access to content there as well. All right, that's going to do it. We'll see you later. God bless.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.